I'm sure the audiences appreciate it. I think we started with a really fascinating discussion between the two Erics on the future of MI, AL. And, I certainly learned a lot from it. We talked a little bit about platforms after that. And the session that just concluded, I thought was super interesting to talk about sort of investment thesis and sort of what's going on in that area with some of the VCs on the panel. But I think where the rubber meets the road is this panel, if I can so say, because with me, I have some of the most forward-leaning practitioners that we have in the ecosystem right now. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and it will be sort of guided by some of the themes that we have heard today, and then some of the questions that I thought we could tease out with sort of having all of this three panelists alongside me as well. So just a quick intro about me. As Bindu said, I'm a long time sort of double clicker in the AI ML space. I recently did a podcast where I laid out some of my thoughts in Me, Myself, and AI. That's an MIT podcast. And then insofar as sort of practicing goes, we are certainly working with some of the leading companies like Abacus in implementing our AI and ML sort of thinking in real life sort of applications within the company as well. So having said that, I wanted to sort of introduce Aditya, Sree, and Monica, who have sort of taken time of their busy sort of holiday season to join us today. But, I'll start with sort of simple intros and ask each of you to maybe just to whet our appetite, share an anecdote about stuff, the first time you maybe encountered AI ML or something that fascinated you, and sort of talk a little bit about the origin story. So I'm going to start with you, Monica, and maybe you can sort of share with us sort of your background and what got you into AI ML, maybe.
Very, very happy to do that. I'm Monica Khurana. I'm the CTO at Dart & Cox. I've been with Dart & Cox now since 2017, so 4 years. I've actually primarily been focused in the financial services industry, having worked in companies like Barclays Global Investors, which is now BlackRock, Guardian Life Insurance, Honest Investments, and so all asset management oriented background. And Dart & Cox is a mutual fund provider. We actually service both the institutional arena as well as the wealth management arena. And we actually, our work requires us to ingest a lot of market data, be it benchmark data, exchange data globally, or purchasing other third-party data sets and bringing them together and looking for correlations on structured and unstructured data with intention to be able to get better predictions. And we are a fundamental value shop. What that means is we are not making decisions purely on quantitative analysis, but we're using that as an input to our decision making. A lot of other parameters and secret sauce goes into the decision making around the investments. So in some sense, there's a case to be made. The appetite for AI was always there, whether we called it AI or not, because we always are in the business of looking at data insights and trying to find those little nuggets that we take with our alpha to our portfolios. So for us, it was quite natural to experiment with AI. We actually started with one person a few years ago in our investment teams, and actually were able to find some good data insights through those correlations, and that actually was a good success story. And we ended up since then building a team that focuses on supporting our investments team. We started with one investment strategy or investment team, and now we are actually expanding and building similar ones in the others. So the growth of AI ML as creating additional data sets for investments has been quite spectacular.
That's great. Thanks for that intro, Monica. And we're going to shift gears to a brand that I love and I sometimes spend a lot for my wife on, which is Sephora. So I'll have Sree just give us a quick intro and then talk to me a little bit about sort of your origin story with AI ML as well.
Thank you, Amit. Hello, everyone. I'm Sree, Chief Technology Officer of Sephora. I joined Sephora just like Monica was saying, 2017, early 2017, so almost 5 years now. And and I was listening to the previous panel, and I was thinking, I mean, you're right. I mean, AI for everybody is different, and the concept and understanding of AI is different. Everything which we use today, including smartphones and everything, is AI. I mean, I mean, AI is part of it. It's just that we don't impress with that because we expect certain things from those smartphones, and as long as it can deliver, I think we are satisfied. But I think the AI, when I think about it, it just that magic behind it, right? When you see something which you did not expect, and it just moves your mind, and I think that's when you realize that the AI has value in it. And I'll go back to my previous work experience, and when I was working for Walmart, there was a situation when extreme demand of consumer in one of the holiday times for TVs, right? And we ran out of TVs pretty much everywhere in the store, and we gathered together certain ML engineers and AI engineers, and they came up with this forecasting plan, which considers not just the allocation within the store, but also the space outside the store, in stocking the products beyond the store capability and store logistics. And the following year, just I was amazed by how they delivered the products when the demand spiked up. They had trucks full of TVs loaded in the back of the stores, because there was not enough space left in the store. And it was just mind boggling to just see that, understanding the consumer demand, predicting it, and forecasting to even figure out how many trucks load of TVs you need to backfill in the back of the store, so that we can then fulfill that demand and satisfy the consumer needs. And that just amazed me. And since then, I've been always curious about the supply chain aspects of AI and the implementation of that, because this story which I was talking about is like late, I would say 2013, 2014 time frame. But I mean, that time, I think AI is still getting its early stages of implementation, and now when I look at it, it has developed so far that all of these capabilities are pretty much out of the box from different vendors which are available. So many models which are out there, and that just got me into this AI space. When I think about Sephora in general, I think it just complicates things further, because beauty, as you can imagine, and Amit, you mentioned that you satisfy your wife's needs through that, and the variations of products and the consumer interests are extremely different. I mean, the consumers who walk into our stores looking at certain products, they have different skin tones, they have different skin concerns, they have different preferences, brand preferences, and understanding those consumer need and giving them what they expect is been one of the biggest challenges. And AI has been like partner in crime in getting there for us, especially in the personalization space.
That's a great story, starting with TVs and sort of leading to Sephora. So appreciate that a lot, Sree. And then we're going to have Aditya speak about where I decidedly spent a lot of my early college years earning and buying the Dell computer of choice. So maybe Aditya, you can give us a little intro and then your own origin story with AI/ML.
Sure, and thank you for having me. So, hey everyone, I am Addy. That's what everybody at Dell calls me. I've been here for the past 8 years, and I am a supply chain person. I've been in supply chain throughout my entire career, and I head up essentially the function for the supply chain that focuses on the digital strategy and roadmap for the supply chain org, including infrastructure, technology, domains, focus areas or use cases. I sort of my org focuses on both building and getting adopted the new tools and technologies that we want everybody to use. And essentially what we're trying to do throughout the Dell supply chain is build in as much automation where necessary, build in orchestration where we need it, and start to insert intelligence into every decision that we can make. Whether that intelligence is augmented, it's assisted, or it's automated. That sort of depends on the needs of the scenario. So for me personally, right, I think the story goes back to funnily enough, my days in paper industry, and back then it was essentially pretty simplistic in terms of how we thought about rules and logic and how PLCs essentially operated. But going from there to looking at what back then used to be called ASRSs, or automated storage and retrieval systems. Essentially, this was this massive mechanical monster with drive motors on it, that knew where to pick up stuff and where to drop off stuff, and optimized for the best path to store and retrieve material from a warehouse. It was really the first time, and I was on the shop floor. I was a field engineer, and I actually got my hands on under the hood, and was able to actually see set this up in real time. Right, that was sort of the start of my personal interest in the space. And then 4 or 5 years ago, when I got the opportunity to go build this team out, and the Dell supply chain used to have a very distributed approach to digital, all things digital, right? Be it automation or AI or ML. It used to have a very distributed approach, and I sort of wanted to get everybody focused and aligned on a clear set of objectives. It was sort of almost a dream come true for me. I think the best use case that I can articulate, right, speaking to something that Sree had talked about, is combining what we did a few years ago was we combined time series forecasting, or an endlessly scalable forecasting module that had like 27, 28 different kinds of models sitting underneath it, optimized for the best forecast. Pair that up with an inventory optimization engine that essentially looks at the demand pattern and tries to define whether your demand pattern is normal or Gaussian or Weibo, and suggest what the right distribution pattern you need to assume for, and then say, here's the stocking level, here's the service level that you need to account for. And then combined that with an optimization engine that allowed you to say, I have 5 different sites. Let's now optimize for maximum service level across all 5 of those sites. So to me, I think that's probably, at this point of time, the best thing of beauty that I have running and in a scaled out fashion across the supply chain organization. And it's fun to see it operate. It's fun when it breaks, because that means we've got something more to do. And that's my intro. Thanks, Amit.
That's great, Adi. And I think, it really frames sort of the second question I was going to get into, but sort of Monica was talking a little bit about sort of, how to bring in all these signal states to sort of, not just make better products, but also, make more sort of timely and relevant sort of communication around those products in front of customers. And what I heard you, Adi, is sort of talking a little bit more about sort of specific to that supply chain vertical. I'm going to double click with you, Sree, and ask you, like, generally in retail, and you guys are great at omni-commerce in terms of, bringing together both sort of the online experience and the offline experience in your 2,600 stores. What use cases sort of excite you when you think about AI and ML in sort of your business? And this should be pretty relevant to a lot of people sort of attending, because a lot of their interface, I would say, surface area of exposure is going to be retail and enterprises. So would love to hear on that from you, Sree.
Yeah. So do you want to go with Monica's space, or we can start with
just where in Sephora you are okay, sort of seeing some of the applications of AI?
Yeah, so there have been a few cases where we have already implemented certain things. I mean, if you look at pre-pandemic, I think we had consumers going into the store, and which is where I think marrying this digital to store comes in play, which actually definitely changed in 2020. We not being an essential business, we had our stores closed, and we had all of that traffic coming to the site. And we had to figure out the intent of the consumer and the context of where they are coming from, what they are trying to look for, what are they browsing for, and understand the relevancy of which products should we show up. Because one of the key things which we miss through the shutdown time frame in the store was the discoverability of the products. We had continuous new product launches which are coming in, and ability for our consumers to understand which products are suited better for them, especially going back to what I was talking about, beauty being very unique, that you have specific skin concerns, you have specific skin tones, and you are looking for certain types of product. So generalizing the website itself doesn't work for our consumer needs, and our focus was primarily into how do we make them very easy for discovery of the product, how do we make them relevant for the client who are visiting our site, and that really drove some aspects of personalization and AI. And I think we made use of all the consumer data which we have a very strong loyalty program today, which consists of close to 90% of our consumers today are loyal, who provide consumer data and their interest and their concerns, and we use that information to predict like what type of consumers are visiting our site and how do we utilize them to predict what type of recommendation we should give, what type of search results we should give, and overall the site experience gets very personalized for the consumers who are visiting it. So that's on the digital front of things. When you look into experiences which we are looking forward to delivering in the store, we had to figure out like where is the consumer spending most of the time, like maybe putting AI vision and video based technologies to figure out where is the heat map of consumer spending time, where are they mostly interested in going, what type of consumer are attracted towards like fragrances versus beauty versus skincare. As we sell all of these products, it becomes relevant for figuring out like how do we place the assortments in the store, because that also drives revenue from a business standpoint, right? I mean, like certain products which you have bigger revenue margins, we need to place them in a certain location so that they are discoverable more by the consumers, and they are also spending more time discovering those products, trying it on. And our stores are around trying products than actually buying products, right? So our experiences are focused into how do we educate about products, how do we listen to consumer about their concerns, how do we try them and test them on the people, and then they come back and purchase these as part of further follow through in the retail space. So all of these have like AI behind the scene, because when you look at it, you don't know when consumers walk into the store what they are actually intending to purchase, what are they there for, and understanding that is the first step of the journey. And then understanding their concerns which they are providing us, and providing the relevant feedback and recommendation through we call the associate app called Advisor Assistant, which was developed in-house, which provides certain capabilities for understanding the consumers need, and asking them certain questions and giving them clear recommendations and guidance on certain products. So these have been really working well for Sephora space.
And that's I think you have hit on some, I think, three key themes that I see sort of in the early adoption curve, and encourage a lot of people listening in to start really leaning in on that. This idea of using sort of this various signal states to achieve better discoverability, right? Which creates this first moment of truth, as we call it in marketing, and sort of this awesome feeling that you came in with something in your mind, and here it's manifested, whether in online or offline. And certainly AI ML models are excellent at sort of at least narrowing down that aperture, so you know which ones to lead with. I also like your idea of recommendations, which is truly, I think, disruptive, because a lot of what we had experienced before, I think, for both online and offline companies was just based on past history per se, and not really relying on the totality of the signals that might be out there. And then the third thing is just, what you're talking about, the user experience, and how do you use that, not just what Adi was talking about in sort of having, first of all, the supply and the forecasting powers to make sure that discoverability and then sort of recommendation, and when you're ready to buy, that item really exists for you to buy and sort of deliver to that customer, but also the totality of that overall experience. I think we're going to see more and more AI and ML sort of, the early adopters who really sort of lean in are going to start separating from the rest of the crowd in doing that. But I have another sort of, question sort of that arises from this conversation we are having. Far too often when I talk to my peers, is that this all sounds great, but it always remains like a skunk works project or a POC, and it's like a specific group within the company and really does not get democratized, right? I think of the early days when I started at McKinsey, and only the analysts were allowed to use Excel. The rest of them used the HP calculator in doing that, right? And here we are almost 20, 25 years later, and it's when you start as an employee, you get that suite of productivity tools. So I'll start with you, Monica. How do sort of we move past the idea of just being at a POC level as a CTO of a large complex company? How do you see that playing out? How do we get past this sort of POC skunkworks stage?
I think you hit a good point, because that is a challenge and rather a concern as one embarks on any of these kind of projects. I think when I take a step back and think about the challenges, I think the first and foremost is being thoughtful about learning to crawl before you walk, before you run. So kind of beginning small, having a very clearly defined objective. You find yourself often in a situation where the data science is telling what the business objective should be. It should actually always be the other way around. The business objective needs to be first defined, and then the data science is supporting that business objective. So that's a perfect example where the prototyping continues forever. Obviously, the intentions on both sides is to get to the right state, but I think having a good structure around how you approach the problem is very important. So thinking from the lens of the clarity and the objective. Then obviously the next to it would come the data, because you need data to train these models. And when it comes to training, the question is the size of the data there to train? It shouldn't be an afterthought. Are there any biases in the data that you need to be aware of? Is the data really representative of the incoming real data? Is it going to really be able to represent that well? And so, all of those things need to be thought out early on. If you don't do that, then you're right. You're kind of in a struggle phase. The other important thing is observability as well, because we think we're supposed to get real-time data on something, but guess what? Some job broke, the real-time data is not coming in, and our model is assuming it's coming in. So having that, assume, not to make assumptions, but actually make sure that what the intention is actually happening is equally important. And last but not the least is always going to be around, making sure, I know I can talk about fitness, I'm not going to go there because it kind of puts it in the bucket of data. But the other important thing is knowing also when to end the prototype. Every situation is not going to be a success story, and it's okay to know it's done, and knowing when to stop versus dragging that prototype phase is equally important. So I think it requires a high level of EQ besides just the AI piece.
That's great. That's a great explanation. And certainly I've seen sort of examples of that, but that's good advice in terms of sort of starting out at a sort of stage of clarity itself, and then also knowing which bets to sunset versus which bets to keep funding around that. Ari, I'll move to you. Certainly supply chain, you have multiple stakeholders. There's states of, I would say, overt and covert resistance sometimes when you try to move from a POC into sort of a wider adoption, because it touches so many different areas internally. How do you see that playing out, and sort of what advice do you have for both practitioners and companies, solution providers, especially in how to navigate from sort of this pet project stage, POC stage, to something which is obviously well adopted throughout the organization?
It's interesting. I think there was a point in time where I actually had to pull a hard stop with our executive team and say, what, folks, the technology is not hard. This technology is actually really easy. What we're trying to deploy over here is really easy. The hard part is the human beings involved with this project that we are trying to roll out. And so to me, if you're going in with a brand new product, a brand new way of approaching things, you need to be spending equal amount, if not more, on the adoption and scaling out of your solution. Just as much time as you spend in development, you need to spend just as much time in adoption and scaling. It comes down to four things, right? Do I have an understanding of how the user base interacts with with said piece of technology, be it AI, ML, recommendation, whatever it might be? Do I have an understanding, or do they have the skills necessary to interact with this piece of a code? Do they have the right role models in their organization that sort of allow them to fail, to experiment, to learn from the experimentation and improve? And then do we have the right measurement mechanisms in place to make sure that it's not fool's gold, and it's not something that we're promising and the model drifts, and we have no knowledge of the fact that the model went off? So to me, I think adoption and scaling all comes down to the understanding of the human psyche and making sure you've mapped out who your target audience is. I know it's more relevant to enterprise use cases rather than consumer use cases in the way that I'm articulating it, but I think the same principle applies on both sides of it, right?
That's very well said. And I think sort of these common themes persist around sort of clarity, and then providing sort of that guidance through the internal states to reach to a resolution around it. So anything you would like to add to it from your experience?
No, I agree. I agree with both of these guys. I think Adi mentioned about the technology is the easiest path, right? I think I totally agree with that. I think it's the people, process, and then technology. I think we need to make the mind shift change of usability of AI, the adoption of AI, and that openness to fail fast and change. Going back to prototype and when to close or when to end the prototype, I think that is also related to the mindset shift that people today are not okay to take okay in taking failures, right? I mean, they don't believe in failures, and they don't believe in the black box. When they don't understand the AI behind or the model, what it does, I think they call it the black box, and that is also not acceptable for certain people in the organization. And that is the biggest challenge, and it's not the technology, right? And I keep telling my team about the AI. When you talk about it like artificial intelligence, there is nothing artificial about it. There is intelligence of some team or a person who's actually building the model, which goes behind it, and the data which comes into the model, which will drive the intelligence of the model itself. So nothing artificial. It all drives based on what you feed it and who's developing it, right? And what intelligence that person is putting into that technology, right? Going back to two things, I would say is that this mind shift, which is the key thing. I think if we spend more time in educating people and training people and having that mind shift, that will have more adoption than just putting a technology out there, trying it out and saying that it failed and shutting it down. The second thing, going back to what Monica was saying, some governance around processes which are there, which is going back to like, are we expecting real-time data? Are we expecting timeliness of the data? Going back to like click streams of the world. I'm talking from the consumer standpoint that when I want to talk about consumer intent, I think the behavior of the consumer at that moment makes it more efficient than getting that data offline 2 days after and saying that, oh, this is what she was trying to do or he was trying to do, and that is not relevant anymore because the consumer has already gone back and changed their mindset and whatnot. So that timeliness of it and the governance around the data which is fed into the model, those two things are important. That's why I was saying people, which is the mind shift, then process, which is the governance and clarity of what has to be fed, and the last thing is the technology, which goes back to the team who's putting that intelligence of the model in place.
Got it. These are pretty sound pieces of advice in how to move past sort of the POC stage. And I really like sort of the theme that you ended with, Sree, as well. It's mindset over skill set, right? Because I think that's where sort of we'll start seeing some of this transition happen and it being adopted much more deeply and richly throughout the organization. So shifting gears a little bit, we often hear sort of this internal challenge, and that Eric Schmidt also talked about it a little bit. You have all this sort of fantastical notions of AI with general intelligence, etc. But when I really think of enterprises, it really comes down to augmentation of processes and making things richer, more experientially amazing, or sort of delivering better products to the end customers, right? And the various functions having sort of the cohesiveness to come together. But would love to know, like, if you take the current projects that you are involved in AI and ML, what are the sources of resistance you face? Is it around sort of this fear factor of replacing people and processes? that sort of scares the senior executives and people in the boardroom? Or do you see other particular instances of sort of internal drag coefficient that might be prescient to talk about today? So I'll start with you, Adi.
Sure. So I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think there is, of course, that fear that you see. I think it was a couple of years ago when we were demoing an early prototype of this particular ML model that was sort of coming out with insights of where our worst supply shortages were. The GSM's first reaction was, okay, what am I going to do then with the rest of my day if this is what your model is going to do? So there is that portion, that element of fear, and I think to me it comes down to how in the user experience or how the user workflow evolves as a result of some of these tools being industrialized. One specific area, right, in supply chain planning as an example, I think the roles in supply chain planning themselves are changing, where you used to have a replenishment planner and a build planner and a systems device planner. You're now starting to say, okay, we've got a set of model builders, we've got a set of model trainers, and we've got a set of model explainers. So the roles themselves are starting to change. But if you approach the classical process and say, this is what you do today, and here's what this model does in that process, sometimes there will be that resistance, because they're like, well, but that's what I spend my entire day on. You just built a model to do what I do my entire day. And going back to the point Sree made, right, you've got to take all of that together so that you understand how the people work today, what their processes look like, and in some cases actually reimagine the process so that they're able to solve, they're able to see a future for themselves. I think the other piece is in terms of resistance that I see is the best being the enemy of good. There is in a lot of environments, there is this desire for does it solve the problem end to end? Right? Does it solve everything? And if it doesn't solve everything, all right, you can go back to your drawing board and come talk to me in 6 months again, right? And I think that's another shift in paradigm as well that we're starting to see. I think there was this joke somewhere that I read, right? What's the difference between a software developer and an ML engineer, right? The software developer is going to test, and then release into production, versus the ML engineer is releasing into production and then testing to improve their model. And I think what we sometimes forget is that the users or the enterprise itself is also trained to that model, where they're expecting that when they receive something, it's perfect, but that's not how AI and ML works. It comes into the world, into the environment, and then afterwards it gets better with time. And I think that's the other sort of resistance that you see. It does things 1 through 10. No, it doesn't do thing number 12 for me. All right, that's it. I'm done. I'm walking away from here. Come back in 6 months.
That's very well said. Sree, anything on your end that you see, especially, I mean, you are part of a pretty global organization. Would love to know, like, what sorts of internal resistance that you see.
Yeah, I think I agree to all the things with Adi said, especially the last part, the ML, the understanding of ML model, which goes back to my mind shift tactics I was talking about. That is critical, that people need to understand how ML works versus a regular code works. And you need to feed information, you need to test, you need to put it in production to really mature it, right? And people have a tendency to figure out, okay, what is the result? Show me the measurement. Show me if it is accurate than what I do or what my analytics does today. And that is where I think we lose a lot of time and value of both ML engineers and the organizational benefits which it will provide. Couple of things I would add. One is, I think the breaking of the bubble from the status quo. I think that has been a bigger challenge. Like, there are so many traditional analysts and organizational business stakeholders who are out there who are okay to continue to use Excel sheets and doing macros and continue to do predictions and all of that, which seemed to work in the past, but the complexity of the data today is not structured anymore, right? And your intent of the customer is continuously changing. And just take the last 2 years, the pre-pandemic consumer is not the current consumer. Current consumer wants to sit on the sofa and order the products. The pre-pandemic consumer, you used to do window shopping, and which you don't see anymore. I mean, there are people who are eager to get out, but there are less and less people going into the store and purchasing the products now. So the consumer demand, as we change, I think we need to also change the way of working and the way of approaching and outside the box thinking itself. And that goes back to this breaking from the bubble of status quo and just opening up to the new ideas and trying it out. And I think that is one. The second thing is from an talent standpoint, I think there are pretty much like you throw a stone at anybody and you'll find an ML engineer or an AI engineer who has the skill in their job description or resume. But in reality is that many people who are truly very good at doing things from an AI and ML standpoint, they do not understand the applicability of it. And the translation of what we can do is actually getting messed between the communication gap between that engineer or the person who's actually driving the technology to the business stakeholder, which adds additional time and the friction for adoption, right? So that is where I think more I would recommend some of the AI and ML engineers to understand the application of that in different industries and figure out how do we communicate that, how do we try it out, how do we test it out, and provide better way of approaching the business stakeholder, which will help us as well.
That's very true.
Yeah, I think certainly manifestations of this that we see around us keep on sort of speaking to this idea of sort of having very strong leadership in pushing through some of these states of change. Because, and I certainly see that from my end as well, that, sometimes bringing together this people, process, and technology requires both sort of deeper faith in sort of, what change can do for the book of business, but also for sort of people's outcomes, right? And the team's outcomes as well. We are running close to sort of the end point, but, I have another sort of overarching question, and I'll start with you, Monica, first on this is, we certainly see a lot of these news stories around and the importance of ethical considerations in AI. And that, I think, at least both from a practitioner perspective, from sort of the general audience perspective, and at the enterprise leadership perspective, I think this is going to get sort of increasingly being talked about. New York just passed a law this week around sort of hiring practices and sort of having ethics as a centerpiece of that. I know in all of your practices, this comes up quite often as well. There are some exciting companies like Credo.ai that are working on this space as well. There are some institutes and think tanks that are starting to come out with thoughts on this. I would love to know, all three of you are enterprise leaders. How is this being referenced internally in your teams, in your work, and sort of what can we take away from your own learnings around sort of ethical considerations with AI and ML? Go ahead, Monica.
Yeah, so I think when I think about the ethical consideration, like I think of breaking it into two segments. One is privacy and surveillance related, which is less relevant in the financial sector because I'm not really using client data. I mean, yes, we use client data to find insight, but we're not publicizing it for any other purposes. But then the other part would be around the bias and discrimination, which is an area we care about a lot because, the biases in the data is something all of us have to be wary about. And then the third one in my mind would be the, how far can AI go relative to human judgment and knowing where to draw those lines. So when I now trying to put this into reality of how we work on it on a day-to-day basis, I think it comes down to how do we think about biases? In some sense, there's a risk because when we put data and take it through a model, and now in some sense, if there is biases in the data because the data is generated from actuality, are we kind of justifying and objectifying the biases and putting some scientific backing behind it? And that's the biggest risk. So we actually are constantly looking at our data sets and looking at it with the viewpoint of biases and unintended consequences. That at the end of the day is the heart of the biggest problem from a prediction perspective as we use AI to make sure we're making the right predictions.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I loved actually the points both Sree and Adi made earlier, both around, he made around the point around the way people are tested. I think I've lost my train of thought. I'll let you go on. But I've
We'll come
lost it.
back to that.
Yes.
But quickly, Adi, like when you think about that, especially in supply chain, there are many manifestations of that. But anything particular sort of stands out to you?
I think there is the obvious stuff that Monica talked about, right? There's the big stuff around privacy, making sure that you're using the data correctly, and I mean, given it's 2021, I think going forward, privacy and security, if nothing, is just going to increase in importance and continue to increase in importance. The biggest piece that I find challenging is essentially when you take a look at models and how they are deployed, the models themselves implicitly have a bias because of the current world that we operate in. And so if there's an assumption around certain rules of the road, so to speak, those biases start to creep into the models as well. You're like, well, this is supposed to be artificial intelligence. It's not supposed to have these biases. Well, to Sree's point, it's not artificial. A human being actually coded this. So whatever biases we have as a collective enterprise make their way into the requirements, into the test criteria, and therefore into the evaluation framework that the model uses. And we're starting to now articulate that and create observability around bias. But by no means have we cracked that nut completely, I would say, at this point.
It's a great set of observations. So I have one last question that we'll do a rapid fire round in. Certainly, there's a lot of people in the audience who are thinking about getting started in sort of the AI ML space, how to internally sort of amp it up. And sort of our own observation has been that sort of partnering companies, like Abacus, other enterprise sort of companies is a huge accelerant in that effort, because getting that, people, process, technology right sometimes requires sort of very astute, synapses with the partners. So would love to know from all three of you, how do companies get started, and sort of what quick advice do you have around it? And I'll start with you, Sree.
Yeah, so if we are talking about organizations like ours to get started, I think start with the application of things, right? And start from efficiency standpoint. I think show the efficiencies and the business gains if we are talking about within the organization. If we are talking about like a startup, like a company, I would say there are two types of startups, right, or two types of companies out there. One is focused on machine learning and AI model standpoint, and they are very flexible, working on different types of model for different types of applications and so on. And there are certain companies who are very focused on certain things, like for example recommendation engines or search engines or personalization services and so on. So I mean, both are good options. It's just that we need to look at what again matters for the business first, and then try to attempt that business with that approach. If you try to generalize it, sometimes again going back to the people process mindset issues, that you won't get hooked up with anybody who's actually championing this within the organization, because they don't really understand how to use that, right? I think that is one of the suggestion I have. Yeah,
that's wonderful. And Monica, when you think about sort of financial services and sort of investment management industry, how to get started internally with AI ML?
Well, I completely agreed with the point Sree made around the clarity of what you're trying to do. And just adding on to that, and this is a point I think Adi made some time back, which was around, thinking about the work you're trying to do and where it fits in the organization, engaging all those people upfront so there is no afterthought around it. If you're going to take on somebody's task, then they be a part of the building of the model, helping make sure it is able to do what it wants to do. And so alignment within the organization could be done upfront, and also figuring out those people or stakeholders that are part of that whole initiative and journey.
That's great. Adi, what about you? How to accelerate sort of rolling it out, both in the forecasting space and sort of the supply chain space? Is it, do you partner with companies? Do you start internally? And how do you accelerate that journey?
I think depends on the scenario or the world that you live in, right? One or the other might make sense. I think, however, in the entire end-to-end supply chain framework, there's only that many use cases really, or kinds of things that you'd want to do. As an example, you probably have a classification problem, you probably have a recommendation problem, you probably have a forecasting problem, a clustering problem, an anomaly problem, and an optimization problem. Those are the 6 kinds of problems that you would typically want to solve in the supply chain. So if you've got a team and you're trying to start out with your practice, find a good use case that isn't trying to chew off too much at once, but that addresses one of these 6 verticals, and then build out from there. Same thing if you're a startup trying to sell to enterprise, right? Is understand the dynamics of the world that you're approaching. As an example, if it's supply chain that you're trying to approach, these are the 6 kinds of things that people usually try to do. So if optimization is your raison d'etre, you basically start with optimization and say, all right, I have a proof of concept or a way for you to get quick value in the supply chain space using optimization, and that's the way I would think about it.
That's wonderful. Personally, I've had sort of a fascinating time listening to all 3 of you, and also whoever's doing the illustration. I think that's been, very awesomely captured, and would make for a nice sort of memento from this conversation. But, I appreciate it, Sree, Adi, Monica. This has been a fascinating sort of, both from a practitioner point of view and just general observations as you lead very complex, large organizations and functions within them. So I'm super excited on sort of what follows from this. And, I'm going to hand it back to you, Bindu. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amit.
Thank you.